The wrapping paper was the first insult, though by now 16 years into this life, I should have been immune to the sting. Sarah's pile of gifts sat on the coffee table like a shimmering mountain range, swathed in gold and silver foil, topped with boughs so elaborate they looked like blooming hydrangeas. My pile, if you could call it that, consisted of 2 modest boxes wrapped in a generic, flat matte paper the store gives you for free. It wasn't tea about the material value. I had stopped caring about things a long time ago, but the visual representation of our worth in the household was so blatant it was almost comedic. We were sitting in the living room, the air thick with the scent of vanilla buttercream and my mother's expensive perfume. It was our 16th birthday. Technically we had shared a womb, but looking at us, you would never guess we shared any DNA at all. Sarah was radiant, her hair a cascade of golden waves that seemed to catch every photon of light in the room. She sat on the velvet sofa, her posture perfect, basking in the adoration of our parents, Mark and Lisa. I sat on the adjacent ottoman, hunched slightly, my dark hair pulled back in a utilitarian ponytail, trying to make myself as small as physically possible. Open the big one first, sweetie. My mother squealed, clapping her manicured hands together. Her eyes were fixed on Sarah with a look of hungry pride, the kind of look a sculptor gives their masterpiece. Sarah giggled, a sound that was light and musical, the soundtrack to our childhood. "Oh, Mom, you guys shouldn't have," she said, though her hands were already tearing into the gold paper with practiced entitlement. I watched Mark, my father, lean forward in his armchair. He had a camera focused entirely on Sarah. I could hear the shutter clicking rapidly, capturing every micro-expression of delight on her face. He didn't look at me. He rarely looked at me unless something was broken or missing. "It's the designer bag," Sarah shrieked, pulling a pristine leather purse from the box. She held it up to her chest, posing instinctively for the camera. "I love it. It's the exact one I pinned on Pinterest." "Only the best for our girl," Mark said, his voice thick with affection. "You've worked so hard this year, Sarah. Straight A's, captain of the cheer squad. You deserve it." I looked down at my hands. I had straight A's too. I was the editor of the school paper. But in this house, my achievements were invisible, or worse, expected. Sarah's successes were miracles. Mine were the bare minimum required to avoid punishment. "Alex, honey, why don't you go get us some sparkling cider from the fridge?" Mom didn't turn her head when she spoke to me. She just issued the command while reaching out to stroke Sarah's hair. "And grab some napkins. Sarah has a little frosting on her chin." "Sure," I said. My voice sounded rusty, unused. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The distance from the living room to the refrigerator felt like crossing a border between 2 warring nations. The kitchen was cold and quiet. I leaned my forehead against the stainless steel of the fridge for a moment, taking a deep breath. This was the dynamic. It had always been the dynamic. Sarah was the sun, burning bright and consuming all the oxygen, and I was the dark matter, invisible and heavy, existing only to fill the empty space she left behind. When I returned with the cider and napkins, Sarah was halfway through unwrapping a set of diamond stud earrings. She didn't thank me when I set the glass down on a coaster near her. "Careful, Alex." Gad snapped suddenly, the camera lowering for the first time. "You almost knocked over her card. Watch where you're going." "You're always so clumsy." I froze. I hadn't come within 6 inches of the card. "I didn't touch it, Dad. Don't talk back," he muttered, instantly dismissing me to refocus his lens on Sarah. "Just sit down and try not to ruin the mood." I sat back on the ottoman. My gifts remained untouched. No one had told me to open them. It was a silent waiting game I played every year. I would wait until the crescendo of Sarah's celebration died down, until the wrapping paper was cleared away, and then, in the awkward silence that followed, I would quietly open my things. Okay, the grand finale," Mom announced, her eyes glistening. She pulled a small box from her pocket. It was a key fob. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. No way, no way. Look out the driveway, Dad said, grinning like a schoolboy. Sarah scrambled off the couch and ran to the window. I didn't need to look to know what was there. I had seen the dealership brochure on Dad's desk weeks ago. A brand new white convertible. Oh my God, I love you guys so much. Sarah screamed, running back to tackle them in a hug. It was a perfect family tableau. The golden child and her benefactors united in joy. I sat there, feeling the familiar coldness spread through my chest. It wasn't jealousy of the car. I didn't even like driving that much. It was the erasure. It was the fact that for 16 years I had been present in every room, at every dinner, in every memory, yet I was essentially a ghost. Eventually the excitement settled. Sarah was texting her friends, the keys clutched in her hand. Mom was sipping her cider, looking exhausted but satisfied. Well, Mom said, finally glancing at the 2 flat boxes on the floor by my feet. Aren't you going to open yours, Alex? The tone was different. It wasn't excited. It was dutiful. It was the tone one uses when reminding a child to brush their teeth. I reached for the first box. It was light. Inside was a daily planner. I flipped it open. It was blank. We thought that might help you get organized, Dad said, taking a sip of his drink. You forgot to take the trash out last Tuesday. Maybe if you write things down, you won't be so forgetful. I nodded slowly. Thanks. I reached for the second box. It was softer. Inside was a beige cardigan. It was 2 sizes too big and made of a scratchy synthetic wool. It was on sale, Mom said, picking a piece of lint off her trousers. I thought it would be practical for the library. You're always in the library. It's nice, I lied. Well, good, Dad said, standing up and stretching. Sarah, why don't we go take some pictures with the car before the sun goes down? The lighting is perfect right now. Coming, Sarah chirped. She grabbed her bag and her keys, bouncing toward the door. They filed out of the room, a parade of triumph. The front door opened and closed, leaving me alone in the living room surrounded by the debris of Sarah's joy. Gold foil littered the floor. The smell of the cake was suddenly nauseating. I looked at the beige cardigan in my lap. It was the color of dust. It was the color of nothing. Happy birthday, Alex, I whispered to the empty room. I stood up and began to clean. It was what I did. I was the scapegoat, the cleaner, the vessel for their frustrations and their indifference. I gathered the gold wrapping paper, crushing it into a garbage bag. Through the window, I could see them in the driveway. Sarah was posing on the hood of the car, throwing her head back in laughter. Mom was adjusting Sarah's hem. Dad was kneeling on the pavement to get the best angle. They looked like a family, a complete, happy unit of 3. I walked to the kitchen and dropped the bag into the bin. I knew, with a sudden, crystal clarity, that this wasn't just about a bad birthday. This was the blueprint for the rest of my life if I stayed. They had assigned me a role before I could even speak. The foil to Sarah's diamond. For her to shine so brightly, someone had to absorb the darkness. I washed the cider glasses in the sink, the water scalding my hands, but I didn't pull away. I needed to feel something real. I needed to remember that I existed, even if they didn't. As the water ran clear, I looked at my reflection in the window above the sink. My eyes were dark and tired, but there was something else there, buried deep beneath the resignation. A spark of anger, a tiny, dangerous ember. I turned off the tap. Outside, the engine of the new car revved, a guttural roar of power and freedom. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked back to the living room. I picked up the planner they had given me, the book meant to catalog my chores and my failures. I went to the drawer where we kept the pens. I took a thick black marker. On the first page of the planner, I didn't write a to-do list. I didn't write a reminder about the trash. I wrote one word, *exit, *. Then I closed the book, picked up the scratchy cardigan, and went upstairs to my room, leaving the golden debris of the living room behind me. The party was over, but I had a feeling the real story was just beginning to start. The smell of freshly cut grass has never triggered a sense of summer nostalgia for me. Instead, it brings back the phantom ache in my lower back and the distinct metallic taste of exhaustion. I was 12 years old when I pushed my father's heavy, gas-guzzling lawnmower across our neighbor's half-acre lot for the first time. It was a sweltering July afternoon, the kind where the humidity clings to your skin like a wet wool blanket. I remember looking back at my own house, wiping sweat from my eyes with a grime-streaked forearm, and seeing Sarah through the bay window. She was lounging on the sofa, bathed in the cool, artificial breeze of the air conditioning, flipping through a glossy magazine. She was 10 then, only 2 years younger, but the distance between our realities was already measured in light years. My parents called it character building. They sat me down at the kitchen table that evening, my hands still trembling slightly from the vibration of the mower, and explained the philosophy that would define my adolescence. You need to learn the value of $1, my father said, his voice grave and authoritative, as if passing down ancient wisdom. Nothing in this world is free. If you want things, clothes, video games, outings with friends, you have to earn them. Self-reliance is the greatest gift we can give you. I nodded, taking the $10 bill I had earned from the neighbor and sliding it into my pocket. At the time, I believed them. I thought this was how the world worked, a universal law of exchange. It wasn't until a week later, when Sarah decided she wanted to start horse riding lessons, that the cracks in their logic began to show. The equipment alone cost more than I would make in a summer of mowing lawns, yet the checkbook appeared without hesitation. There was no lecture about the value of $1 for Sarah, no speech about earning her way. There was only the indulgent smile of my mother as she said, "She's just so passionate about it. How could we say no?" By the time I reached high school, the disparity had evolved from a nuisance into a gaping wound. My life was a juggling act of AP classes and 20 hours a week at a local diner. I smelled permanently of stale fryer grease and cheap coffee. Every paycheck was meticulously budgeted. 30% for the college fund my parents refused to contribute to, 20% for clothes and school supplies, and the rest for the inevitable costs of existing. I bought my own textbooks. I paid for my own field trips. When the soles of my sneakers wore thin, I taped them until I could afford a replacement pair from the discount rack. One particularly bitter Tuesday, I came home after a grueling shift to find a dining room table covered in shopping bags. Sarah, now a sophomore, was modeling a series of designer dresses for an upcoming school dance. She spun around, the silk catching the light, beaming at my parents who were clapping delightedly from the sidelines. "Do you like this one?" Sarah asked, breathless with excitement. "Mom says it brings out my eyes." I stood in the doorway, my feet aching in my worn-out shoes, clutching an envelope containing my meager tips. "How much was it?" I asked, my voice flat. My father turned, his expression hardening instantly. "That's none of your business. Don't dampen your sister's joy just because you're in a mood. I need $50 for the AP history exam fee," I said, unable to stop the words. "I'm short this week because the diner cut my hours." My mother sighed, the joy draining from her face as if I had insulted her personally. "We've discussed this. Poor planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on ours. You should have dipped into your savings." "My savings are for tuition," I argued, gesturing at the mountain of clothes on the table. "You just spent hundreds on dresses she'll wear once. Why is her luxury more important than my education?" "It's not about the money," my father snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "It's about the principle. Sarah is different. She needs us to provide these experiences for her social development. You, on the other hand, need to learn how to survive. If we bail you out now, you'll never learn to stand on your own 2 feet." I walked away then, the injustice burning in my throat like bile. I paid for the exam by skipping lunch for 3 weeks. The breaking point, the moment the resentment calcified into something permanent, arrived during my senior year. It was the spring before graduation, and the topic of cars had dominated the household. I had spent 3 years saving every spare cent for a vehicle. I had managed to scrape together $2,000, enough for a rusted Honda Civic with an erratic transmission and a heater that only worked in the summer. I was proud of that car. It was ugly and loud, but it was mine. 2 weeks after I bought it, Sarah turned 16. I was in the driveway, changing the oil in my Civic, when a flatbed truck pulled up to the curb. My parents walked out the front door, Sarah trailing behind them with a blindfold over her eyes. My stomach dropped. I wiped my greasy hands on the rag and stood up, watching the scene unfold with a sense of impending doom. The driver unloaded a brand new cherry red convertible. It gleamed in the sunlight, pristine and perfect. It wasn't an entry-level model. It was a status symbol, fully loaded. "Okay, honey, take it off," my mother squealed. Sarah ripped off the blindfold and screamed. She jumped up and down, hugging them both, tears streaming down her face. "You guys are the best. It's perfect." I stood frozen by my heap of scrap metal. My father looked over at me and for a split second, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or maybe just annoyance that I was there to witness the hypocrisy. He walked over to me while Sarah sat in a driver's seat, revving the engine. "Now, don't make a scene," he said quietly, his voice low and warning. "We leased it. It's safer for her. You know she's not as street smart as you are. She needs the safety features." "Safety features?" I repeated, my voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt cold. "I drive a car that shakes when it hits 50 miles an hour. I paid for every bolt in that thing. You told me that buying a car was a rite of passage into adulthood." "And it is," he insisted, crossing his arms. "Look at you. You know how to change your own oil. You know the value of maintenance. Sarah ... She just isn't built for that kind of stress. We're doing what's right for each of you individually. You're punishing me for being competent," I spat out, the realization finally crystallizing. "You don't care about self-reliance. You just like playing hero to her because she lets you. I'm the one who actually listened to you, and I'm the one who pays for it. That is enough," he growled. "You are ungrateful. We put a roof over your head. We feed you. I feed myself," I shouted, the volume of my voice startling Sarah, who looked over from her new leather throne. "I buy my clothes, I pay for my gas, I paid for my own sats. You haven't raised me. I raised myself while you played audience to her." I threw the oily rag onto the driveway, the black stain spreading on the concrete. I didn't wait for his response. I got into my rusted Civic, the door creaking loudly in the silence that followed my outburst, and turned the key. It took 2 tries to start. As I backed out, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, my mother comforting Sarah, who looked confused and upset that her moment had been tarnished. My father just stood there, watching me go, his jaw set in a line of stubborn righteousness. I drove until the tank was nearly empty. I realized then that the lecture on the value of $1 was never about money. It was a convenient fiction they used to justify their favoritism. A shield to hide the fact that they simply preferred the child who needed them over the child who didn't. They had forced me to become independent, and in doing so, they had ensured that once I left, I would never need to come back. The disparity hadn't just built my character. It had built a wall between us that no amount of money could ever dismantle. The week leading up to our 18th birthday felt less like a celebration and more like a coronation. The air in the house was thick with the scent of expensive lily and the frantic energy of my mother, ensuring every detail was perfect. Sarah floated through the hallways, a benevolent dictator in silk pajamas, directing the placement of balloons and tasting hors d'oeuvres with the critical eye of a Michelin judge. I, on the other hand, was a ghost in my own home, weaving through the chaos like a specter everyone refused to acknowledge. "Make sure you move your books out of the living room," my mother had snapped at me 2 days prior, her eyes scanning a checklist without actually looking at me. "The caterers need that space for the champagne tower. And try to find something decent to wear." We don't want you looking like a vagrant in the background of Sarah's photos. I had nodded, the familiar dull ache in my chest throbbing a little harder. I had spent the last of my savings on a modest dress, hoping to look presentable, perhaps even pretty, for the milestone we were supposed to be sharing. But as the sun set on the eve of our birthday, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The banner hanging across the grand foyer didn't say "Happy Birthday Twins" in glittering gold calligraphy. Spanning 10 feet, it read, * Happy 18th Birthday, Sarah, our shining star *. The day of the party arrived with a headache that bloomed behind my eyes the moment I woke up. No breakfast in bed awaited us, or rather, Sarah received a tray of pastries and fresh fruit, while I scavenged a piece of toast in the kitchen before being shooed away by the florists. By evening, the house was transformed. It looked like a page out of a high society magazine, glittering and golden, filled with people who were friends of my parents or admirers of my sister. I stood near the edge of the room, clutching a glass of sparkling water, watching the spectacle. Sarah looked radiant, I had to admit. She wore a custom-made gown that shimmered under the chandelier lights, laughing as she held court in the center of the room. Every few minutes, a guest would approach me, their eyes sliding over my face with vague confusion before asking, "Could you grab me a fresh napkin?" Or, "Do you know where the restroom is? I wasn't a daughter tonight. I was part of the furniture." "Smile, for heaven's sake," my mother hissed in my ear, appearing suddenly at my elbow. Her fingers dug into my arm, her smile fixed and terrifyingly bright for the room at large. "You look like you're at a funeral. Don't ruin your sister's mood with your sullenness." "It's my birthday too, Mother," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. She rolled her eyes, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a slap. "Don't be dramatic. You know Sarah loves big parties. We'll do a nice dinner for you next week, maybe pizza. Now, go help the servers with the canapes. They're running behind." I stood frozen as she drifted away, swallowed back into the adoring crowd. Next week. Pizza. The disparity was so comical I almost laughed, but the laughter died in my throat as the music cut out. A spotlight swept across the room, landing on the grand staircase where my father stood, holding a microphone. "Attention everyone," his voice boomed rich with pride. "If I could have your attention for the most important moment of the evening." The room hushed. I stepped forward slightly, a foolish tiny ember of hope sparking in my chest. Maybe this was it. Maybe they would acknowledge me now. Maybe they would call me up to stand beside her. 18 years ago, our lives were blessed, my father began, his eyes locking onto Sarah, who was beaming in the center of the room. "We were given a daughter of grace, beauty, and immense talent. Sarah, you have been the light of our lives. Watching you grow into the woman you are today has been our greatest privilege." He gestured for her to join him. She ascended the stairs, the crowd cheering. I remained on the floor, my feet rooted to the hardwood, invisible. "We wanted to give you something special," my mother added, taking the microphone. "Something that represents the journey you are about to embark on." The front door swung open. Through the gap, parked on the circular driveway and illuminated by strategically placed floodlights, sat a brand new cherry red convertible. A collective gasp went through the room. Sarah screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure delight, and rushed into our parents' arms. "Happy birthday, princess," my father shouted. The applause was deafening. I stood there, my hands empty, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. No car, no gift. Not even a card. I looked around the room, waiting for anyone to notice the other twin standing alone in the shadows. But all eyes were on the driveway. Then came the cake. It was wheeled out on a massive cart, a 5-tier monstrosity covered in fondant roses and gold leaf. The crowd began to sing, a roaring chorus of happy birthday. I watched the candles flickering, the heat from them distorting the air. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. I took a breath, preparing to blow out the candles, stepping closer to the cart instinctively. Just as the song reached its crescendo asterisk, "Happy birthday dear Sarah asterisk," my father placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Not to embrace me, but to stop me. He leaned down, his voice a low growl beneath the cheering. "Step back. You're blocking the photographer's angle of your sister." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The singing ended. Sarah blew out the candles, the smoke curling around her triumphant smile. The shutter of the camera clicked rapidly, immortalizing her joy and my erasure. That was it. The final insult wasn't the car, or the banner, or the lack of gifts. It was the physical act of being pushed out of the frame of my own existence. It was the realization that to them, I wasn't just the second favorite. I was an obstruction. Something inside me, a tether that had been fraying for 18 years, finally snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was silent, cold, and absolute. I turned around. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, catching sight of my movement as the applause died down and the cake was being cut. Her tone was annoyed, implying I was making a scene by simply leaving it. I stopped and looked at her. Really looked at her. I shalallahu alayhi wasallam, the superficial worry lines, the emptiness in her eyes, the complete lack of maternal warmth. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady, loud enough for the small circle of guests nearby to hear. "Don't be ridiculous," she scoffed, lowering her voice. "We haven't cut the cake. You need to be in the background for the family toast." "I am not a prop," I said, the volume of my voice rising, cutting through the ambient chatter. "And I am not a guest at my own birthday party." The conversation nearby stopped. Sarah looked up from her cake, the knife paused in her hand, a flicker of genuine confusion on her face, as if she had forgotten I was there until this very moment. "You have made it perfectly clear that I don't exist to you," I continued, the adrenaline clarifying my thoughts, making everything sharp and bright. "You threw a coronation for one daughter and asked the other to serve drinks. You bought a car for one and didn't even buy a card for the other. I'm done. I am done being the ghost in this house." "You are embarrassing yourself," my father barked, stepping down from the stairs, his face flushing red. "Go to your room immediately." "No," I said. The word hung in the air, heavy and powerful. "I'm 18. I'm a legal adult. And I'm leaving." I didn't wait for their response. I turned my back on the gold balloons, the $3,000 cake, and the red convertible. I walked through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of shock and pity that I no longer cared to decipher. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The noise of the party faded instantly, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. I didn't have a car. I didn't have a trust fund. I had a bag I had packed 3 days ago hidden under my bed, which I would retrieve the moment the house was asleep, and a few $100s in cash. But as I walked down the long winding driveway, past the floodlights illuminating Sarah's new car, I looked up at the moon. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like loneliness, it felt like freedom. The anticipation was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. My 18th birthday hadn't been a celebration, but it was a gift nonetheless. It was the day I finally gave myself permission to disappear from their lives for good. The migration from the living room to the outdoors felt like a slow-moving tide, a sea of sequins and velvet flowing through the French doors. I drifted at the back of the pack, a piece of driftwood caught in the wake of my family's social circle. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of jasmine and the expensive perfume of my mother's friends, but underneath it all, there was the metallic tang of anticipation. My father led the way, his arms swept out like a ringmaster commanding his circus, guiding the guests toward the expansive paver driveway that curved around the front of the house. "Come on, everyone. This way." Dad boomed, his voice thick with a mixture of champagne and pride. "We have one final surprise for the evening." I stuffed my hands into the pockets of my trousers, keeping my head down. I already knew something big was happening. I had seen the delivery truck earlier that afternoon when I was taking out the recycling, a task seemingly, reserved for me even on days of celebration. I had seen the shape of it under the tarp, seen the hushed urgency with which the delivery man moved, but seeing the silhouette and witnessing the unveiling were two very different kinds of torture. The crowd fanned out in a semicircle, leaving a respectful distance from the object parked directly under the floodlights. It was covered in a heavy silver satin sheet that shimmered like liquid mercury. Sarah stood front and center, her hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide and wet with performed shock. She wore a dress that cost more than my entire wardrobe, a shimmering gold thing that caught the light and made her look like a statuette, a prize to be won. Mom stepped up beside her, wrapping a protective arm around Sarah's waist. She looked at my sister with a gaze so intense, so filled with adoration, that it felt like looking directly into the sun, blinding and impossible to endure for too long. "Attention everyone," Mom said, her voice trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the sheer ecstasy of the moment. "We all know how hard this year has been. The late night studying, the pressure, the endless extracurriculars. Most people would have crumbled." I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. I thought about my own late nights, the double shifts I pulled at the library to save for a laptop, the grades I maintained that were identical to Sarah's. But my efforts were viewed as expectations. Hers were viewed as miracles. "But not our Sarah," Dad interjected, taking the other side. "She handled it with grace, with poise. And when you have a daughter who exemplifies excellence in every way, you want to show her that the world notices." He nodded to one of the caterers standing by the edge of the sheet. With a dramatic flourish, the satin was pulled away. The collective gasp of the crowd sucked the air out of the driveway. There, gleaming under the harsh white of the party lights, sat a brand new BMW convertible. It was white alpine white. If I recall the brochure I'd seen on Dad's desk weeks ago, pristine and aggressive in its beauty. Sitting on the hood, comically large but undeniably effective, was a giant red velvet bow, its ribbons cascading down the grille like a waterfall of blood against snow. "Oh my God!" Sarah shrieked. It was a sound that pierced the night, sharp and jubilant. She didn't run to the car immediately. Instead, she collapsed into our parents. It was a perfect tableau of the nuclear family if you ignored the one member standing 20 feet away in the shadows. Dad kissed her forehead. Mom wiped a tear from her own cheek. They beamed with a pride that was physical, a radiant energy that seemed to illuminate the driveway more than the halogen bulbs overhead. "You deserve this, sweetheart," Mom said, her voice amplified by the silence of the awestruck crowd. "You deserve the best, because you are the best. Go on," Dad encouraged, dangling the keys that caught the light with a silver glint. "It's all yours." Sarah snatched the keys, her hands shaking, and rushed toward the machine. She ran her hand along the fender as if petting a wild animal she had tamed. The leather interior was tan, the dashboard futuristic and glowing. It was a machine built for someone who mattered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you," she cried out, spinning around to face the crowd, holding the keys aloft like a trophy. The applause that followed was deafening. It started with the polite clapping of the elders and swelled into a raucous cheer from her friends and our relatives. People were whistling, shouting congratulations, clapping so hard their hands must have stung. I stood frozen. I tried to clap. I willed my hands to come together, to join in the communal joy, to be a good brother, but my arms felt like lead. The applause roared in my ears, sounding less like celebration and more like static, a wall of white noise separating me from them. I looked at my parents. They weren't looking at the car. They weren't looking at the guests. Their eyes were locked on Sarah, shining with a terrifyingly singular focus. In that look, there was no room for anyone else. The joy in their eyes was solely for her. It wasn't just that they had bought her a car. It was that they had bought into the idea that she was the protagonist of this life, and I was merely background decoration. A heavy lump formed in my throat, hot and jagged. I watched Sarah open the door and slide into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. She looked natural there. She looked like she belonged in the lap of luxury. "Rev it," someone shouted from the back. Sarah laughed, looked at Dad for permission. He nodded enthusiastically and pushed the button. The engine roared to life, a deep guttural purr that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The crowd cheered again, louder this time. In the midst of the noise, Mom turned slightly, scanning the crowd. For a heartbeat, her eyes swept over the area where I stood. I held my breath, waiting for the recognition, waiting for the wave, the signal to come join them, to come sit in the passenger seat, to be part of the moment. But her gaze slid right past me, unfocused and unseeing, before snapping back to the girl in the white car. I wasn't being excluded out of malice, I realized with a sudden crushing clarity. That would have been easier to handle. Anger is easier than irrelevance. I was being excluded because, in their universe, I simply didn't possess enough gravity to register. The turning point didn't come with a shout or a fight. It came with the slam of a car door. As Sarah shut herself inside the pristine white cabin, cocooned in her gift, and the applause washed over her, I took a single step backward. Then another. The gravel crunched softly under my heel, a sound completely swallowed by the ovation. I turned away from the light, away from the gleaming BMW and the red bow, and walked back toward the dark side of the house. No one called my name. No one noticed the gap in the crowd. The celebration continued, loud and bright, a party for 3 that 100 people were attending, while I faded into the quiet of the unlit garden, finally understanding exactly where I stood. The applause for Sarah finally began to die down, leaving a heavy, suffocating scent of expensive perfume and celebration in the air. She was beaming, clutching the keys to her new car against her chest like a newborn baby, surrounded by a mountain of wrapping paper that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. My mother was wiping a tear from her eye, murmuring about how proud she was, how much Sarah deserved this for trying her best this semester. I stood on the periphery of the living room, a ghost in my own house, holding a half-empty cup of punch and waiting for the ground to swallow me whole. I hadn't expected a car. I hadn't even expected a party. But I had foolishly allowed a tiny traitorous spark of hope to ignite in my chest that maybe, just maybe they had remembered I existed too. The room quieted as the focus shifted. It wasn't a natural lull. It was the kind of silence that precedes a punchline. My father turned away from Sarah, his face flushed with the high of being the benevolent patriarch. He scanned the room until his eyes locked onto me. There was no warmth in that gaze, only a glint of mischief that usually signaled I was about to be the butt of a joke I didn't understand. "Well now," he announced, his voice booming a little too loudly for the small gathering. "We can't forget about our other scholar, can we?" He reached behind the sofa cushion, as if the thought of me had been stuffed away there as an afterthought, and produced a small, square box. It was wrapped loosely in leftover paper, the tape jagged and yellowing. He walked over to me, a smirk playing on his lips that made my stomach turn over. It was the same look he had when he detailed embarrassing stories about me to his work friends, framing my failures as hilarity. "Go on," he urged, thrusting the box into my hands. "Open it." The box was light, suspiciously light. It rattled when I took it, a hollow cheap sound that echoed the emptiness I was suddenly feeling. Sarah was watching me, her smile tight, a flicker of genuine pity warring with her satisfaction. My mother just watched, her expression unreadable, her hand still resting on Sarah's shoulder. I peeled back the paper. It came away easily, revealing no box underneath, just the object itself. It was a piggy bank, but not a ceramic keepsake, or something engraved, or even something kitschy and cute. It was a translucent, neon pink plastic pig, the kind you buy in a dollar store bin near the checkout counter. The seam of the plastic was rough and jagged running down the pig's snout. Through the cheap, cloudy material, I could see a single lonely dollar bill folded inside. I stared at it. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "There you go," my father chuckled, the sound grating against the sudden silence of the room. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing tight enough to bruise. Don't spend it all in one place, kiddo. Start saving up and maybe one day you'll get there. He laughed at his own wit, looking around the room for validation. Get it? Because Sarah got the car and you get gas money, eventually. He threw his head back, laughing harder, but he was laughing alone. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was physical. It pressed against my eardrums. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My aunt cleared her throat and looked down at her shoes, suddenly finding the carpet fascinating. Even Sarah looked away, her cheeks flushing a dull red, though she didn't say a word to stop him. My mother offered a nervous, fluttery laugh that died almost instantly, but she didn't reprimand him. She didn't step in. She stood by the golden child and let the shadow fall on me. I stood there, holding that $2 trinket in hands that had gone numb. The plastic felt greasy against my skin. The single dollar bill inside mocked me. It wasn't a gift. It was a prop for his comedy routine. I was the prop. For years I had made excuses for them. I told myself they were just hard on me because they wanted me to be tough. I told myself Sarah needed more help because she was less independent. I told myself that they loved us equally, just differently. I had built a cathedral of lies to protect myself from the truth, brick by agonizing brick. But in that moment, looking at the jagged plastic seam of that pig, the cathedral collapsed. It wasn't about the money. If they had given me a handwritten card with nothing in it, I would have cherished it. If they had given me nothing but a hug and a good job, I would have been satisfied. This was active malice. This was a calculated effort to humiliate me in front of the extended family, to establish a hierarchy where I was at the bottom, scraping for scraps while they feasted. I looked up from the pig and met my father's eyes. He was still grinning, waiting for me to be a good sport, waiting for me to force a laugh, and play along with the degradation so the family dynamic could remain undisturbed. He expected me to be the punching bag that absorbed the blow and bounced back smiling. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud crack. It was the quiet sound of a tether being cut. The desperate need for their approval, the hunger for a scrap of affection, the constant anxiety of trying to be good enough, it all evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. They didn't care about me. They didn't just favor Sarah. They actively enjoyed belittling me. My pain was their entertainment. My exclusion was the glue that held their little unit together. I wasn't a member of this family. I was the foil they used to make Sarah look brighter. Thank you, I said. My voice was steady, too steady. It didn't sound like my voice at all. It sounded like a stranger's, someone older, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. My father's smile faltered slightly. He had expected me to get angry, or to cry, or to make a joke. He hadn't expected the flat, dead tone of total indifference. Well, he stammered, pulling his hand back from my shoulder. It's just a little joke, you know. Lighten up. I know, I said, locking eyes with him. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I let him see the absolute zero behind my eyes. It's hilarious. I walked over to the coffee table, where Sarah's pile of gifts lay like a dragon's hoard. With deliberate slow movements, I placed the pink plastic pig right in the center of the table, next to the car keys. The contrast was grotesque, the glimmering fob next to the dollar store trash. I think I'll leave it here, I said, turning to face the room. I wouldn't want to lose something so valuable. The discomfort in the room spiked into alarm. My mother finally stepped forward, her hands wringing together. Honey, don't be like that. Dad was being dad, I interrupted, cutting her off for the first time in my life. And Mom was being Mom, and I'm done. I didn't shout, I didn't storm out. I simply turned around and walked toward the hallway. The silence behind me was absolute. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, confused and terrified by the shift in the atmosphere. They were waiting for the tantrum, but I gave them the only thing that actually hurts a narcissist. I gave them nothing. As I reached the door, my father called out, his voice tinged with a sudden nervous aggression. If you walk out that door, don't expect a ride home. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. I looked back at them one last time, a tableau of suburban dysfunction frozen under the living room lights. I looked at the plastic pig sitting on the table, the perfect monument to our relationship. "I'll walk," I said. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. As the latch clicked shut behind me, sealing the noise and the perfume and the cruelty inside, I took the first deep breath I had taken in years. I had $2 to my name and nowhere to go, but as I began to walk down the driveway, leaving the new car and the plastic pig behind, I felt lighter than air. I was broke, I was alone, but for the first time in my life, I was free. The rest of the night was a blur of high-definition torture, a performance I hadn't realized I was capable of giving. I remained silent, not with the sulking petulance of a child, but with the stony resolve of someone who had already checked out. A quiet fury brewed inside me, hot and dense, like magma trapped beneath a crust of polite smiles and affirmative nods. I drifted through the crowd of relatives and family friends, a ghost in my own home, offering robotic pleasantries whenever someone cornered me. "You're so quiet tonight," an aunt commented, her wine glass tilting dangerously. "Overwhelmed by all the love?" "Something like that," I replied, my voice steady, my eyes dead. I watched them laugh. I watched my parents bask in the glow of being the benevolent providers, receiving compliments on the food, the decor, the atmosphere. They were the perfect hosts, and I was the perfect prop. But every time I looked at them, all I could see was that plastic piggy bank. It wasn't just a bad gift, it was a valuation. It was a statement that, in the grand calculus of this family, I was an afterthought worth exactly $2 and some change. When the clock struck 10, I feigned a yawn that felt heavy enough to be real. I rubbed my temples, pleading a sudden onset of a migraine brought on by the excitement. My mother waved me off with a distracted hand, barely looking away from her conversation with the neighbor. It was the permission I needed. "Good night," I whispered to no one in particular. I retreated to my room, closing the door softly. The moment the latch clicked, the mask fell. I didn't cry. Tears were for people who thought things could be fixed, who believed that if they just expressed enough sorrow, someone would come to comfort them. I knew better. I leaned my back against the wood of the door and exhaled a long, shaky breath. The anger that had been simmering all night began to crystallize into a plan. I sat on the edge of my bed and waited. 11 o'clock. The music downstairs stopped. Midnight. The sound of cars leaving the driveway, gravel crunching under tires. 1 o'clock. The heavy thud of the front door locking. Footsteps in the hall. My father's cough. My mother's voice, muffled and tired. Then silence. I gave them an extra hour to be safe. I sat in the dark, my eyes adjusted to the shadows, watching the red digital numbers on my alarm. Clock sliced through the 2 a.m. Gloom. 1:58. 1:59. The house was utterly silent. It was a tomb of expensive furniture and hollow memories. I stood up and moved with the precision of a soldier. I didn't turn on the light. I pulled my old duffel bag from the back of the closet, the dust on the canvas feeling gritty against my fingers. I didn't pack everything. I didn't want everything. I wanted only what was necessary for survival, and nothing that carried the weight of their conditional love. 3 pairs of jeans. 7 t-shirts. My hoodie, underwear, socks. I moved to my desk, opening the bottom drawer where I kept the folder I had secretly curated over the last 6 months. This was the most important part. Birth certificate, social security card, the title to the car, my passport. I shoved the folder deep into the bottom of the bag, beneath the clothes. I looked around the room one last time. Posters on the wall, trophies on the shelf from sports I hated, but was forced to play, a bookshelf full of textbooks. "Keep it," I whispered. I zipped the bag. It wasn't heavy, but it carried the weight of my entire future. I opened my bedroom door. The hinges, usually prone to squeaking, remained silent, as if the house itself wanted me gone. I crept down the hallway, stepping over the floorboard that always creaked, navigating the darkness by memory. The stairs were the hardest part. I descended slowly, placing my weight on the edges of the steps, breathing through my nose. The living room was bathed in moonlight filtering through the sheer curtains. Remnants of the party lay scattered about, half-empty cups, crumpled napkins, the ghostly shapes of balloons. I walked past them, feeling like an intruder in a museum exhibit. I entered the kitchen. The granite countertops gleamed cold and hard. I placed my duffel bag on the floor and reached into my pocket. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of my house key. I pulled it out. It was a simple piece of brass, but it felt like a shackle. I placed it gently on the center of the kitchen island, where my mother would undoubtedly see it the moment she walked in for her morning coffee. Then, I reached into my other pocket. I pulled out the pink plastic pig. The $2 were still rattling inside. I placed the piggy bank directly on top of the key. It was a monument to their parenting, a final transaction. They had paid me $2 for my compliance, and I was returning the change. I stared at it for a second, the cheap plastic against the expensive stone. It looked ridiculous. It looked perfect. We're even, I thought. I picked up my bag and walked to the back door. I unlocked it, the bolt sliding back with a soft asterisk clack asterisk that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I froze, waiting for a shout, a light, footsteps. Nothing. I slipped out into the cool night air. The humidity hit me first, followed by the smell of wet grass and jasmine. I didn't look back at the house. If I looked back, I might turn to stone. I walked down the long driveway toward the detached garage area where the overflow cars were parked. And there it was. My escape pod. It was a 10-year-old sedan, paint fading on the hood, a dent in the rear bumper from a fender bender 3 years ago. It was ugly, reliable, and invisible to them. But it was legally mine. My father had put the title in my name years ago to exploit a loophole for cheaper insurance rates for the family fleet. He has saved a few $100 a year. Tonight, that greed was costing him his child. I unlocked the door and threw the duffel bag onto the passenger seat. The interior smelled of old fabric and stale heat. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of crossing the Rubicon. I inserted the key into the ignition. This was the moment of truth. If it didn't start, I was stranded. If it made a loud noise, I was caught. I turned the key. The engine sputtered once, hesitated, and then caught life with a low, steady rumble. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I didn't turn on the headlights. I kept my foot off the brake to avoid the flare of red tail lights illuminating the yard. I shifted into reverse and let the car roll backward down the driveway, guiding it by the pale moonlight. Once I hit the street, I shifted into drive. I rolled forward, keeping the speed slow, barely crawling until I was 2 houses away. Then I flicked on the headlights. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. I pressed the gas pedal. The house, the party, the plastic pig, the silent judgments, the conditional love, it all disappeared into the rearview mirror. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew I wasn't coming back. I was reclaiming my life, 1 mile at a time, leaving that toxic environment behind forever. I drove into the night, and for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't heavy. It was free. The first thing I did when I pulled onto the highway, putting miles of asphalt between myself and the house I used to call home, was pull over at a rest stop. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally severing the limb to save the body. I took out my phone. It was flooded with missed calls and texts, a chaotic stream of demands from my mother and confused, entitled messages from Sarah. I didn't read them. One by one, I went through my contacts. Select. Block. Confirm. I did it for my mother. I did it for Sarah. And finally, I did it for my father. When the screen went silent, the quiet inside the car felt heavy, but for the first time in my life, it was mine. For 3 days, the silence held. I drove 3 towns over, crashed on a friend's couch, and began the process of looking for a cheap apartment. I thought I was in the clear until a notification popped up on my screen, a voicemail from an unknown number. My stomach dropped. I knew who it was before I even pressed play. My father's voice filled the small room, stripped of any pretense of paternal care. It was a voice of cold, seething authority. "I don't know who you think you are," the recording hissed, static crackling over the line. "But you don't get to just walk away with my property. That car you're driving. If it's not in the driveway by tomorrow morning, I'm reporting it stolen. I'll have the police arrest you. Don't test me." The recording ended. My heart hammered against my ribs, a conditioned response to years of walking on eggshells. Panic flared, hot and suffocating. Asterisk, he's going to call the cops. I'm going to jail. Asterisk, but then the fog of fear lifted, replaced by a cold, hard logic I had cultivated in secret. I walked over to my bag and pulled out the manila envelope I had grabbed before leaving. Inside was the pink slip. I stared at the line where the owner's name was printed. It was my name, not his. I had paid for the car with money earned from summer jobs they thought I was squandering. I paid the insurance. I paid the registration. I didn't delete the voicemail. I saved it. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a reminder of why I could never go back. I didn't respond. I didn't drive back. I simply went to work. The years that followed were a blur of exhaustion and grit. I didn't have the safety net that Sarah had. I worked double shifts at a diner while putting myself through community college, then transferred to a university on a scholarship I fought tooth and nail to get. There were nights I ate nothing but instant rice, nights I cried from sheer exhaustion, and holidays spent alone in a drafty apartment while the rest of the world celebrated with family. But every hardship was a badge of honor because I owned it. No one could hold my tuition over my head. No one could threaten to take away my housing if I didn't smile enough or act grateful enough. Slowly the grit turned into traction. I graduated with honors. I landed an internship that turned into a junior executive position. I moved from the drafty apartment to a condo with a view of the city skyline. I built a circle of friends who loved me for who I was, not what I could do for them. I became a new person, forged in the fire of my own independence. It was nearly 5 years later when the past tried to knock on my door, not with a bang, but with a whisper. I met up with my Aunt Linda for lunch. She was the only relative I hadn't blocked, mostly because she had always been a neutral party, living halfway across the country and removed from the daily toxicity of my immediate family. She looked at me over her glass of iced tea, her expression pitying. "You look good," she said, sounding surprised. "Really good. I am good, Aunt Linda. Life is good." She hesitated, tracing the rim of her glass. "Have you heard from them, your parents?" "No," I said sharply. "And I don't intend to." "They're not doing well," she said quietly. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling nothing. "Is that so?" "Sarah." "Well, it started right after you left." Linda sighed, leaning in as if sharing a scandal. "You know that BMW they bought her? The one that cost all that, I remember," I said dryly. "Trouble?" "She had it for 3 months. Totaled, it wrapped around a telephone pole. She walked away without a scratch, thank God, but she was under the influence. The insurance didn't pay out. Your father tried to cover it up, spent a fortune on lawyers to keep her record clean." I felt a dark, ironic chuckle bubble up in my chest. "Let me guess. That wasn't the end of it. She dropped out of college twice," Linda continued. "She moved back home. She refuses to work. Your parents ... they refinanced the house to pay for her mistakes. Then your dad got laid off last year. They're drowning, honey. They might lose the house." I sat back, processing the information. For years, I had imagined them living a perfect life without the black sheep dragging them down. To hear that the golden child had tarnished the gold was a twist I hadn't expected. "They talk about you," Linda added, her voice dropping to a whisper. Your dad. He admitted he might have been too hard on you. They know you're doing well. They've seen your LinkedIn. They know you have money now. They don't miss me, I said, my voice steady and cold. They miss having a scapegoat, and now they need a bank. They want to reach out, she pressed. Your mom asked for your number. Don't give it to her. The attempt came anyway. A week later, an email bypassed my spam filter. It was from my mother. The subject line read, *family. I opened it against my better judgment. It was a long, rambling wall of text. There was no apology for the years of neglect, no acknowledgement of the emotional abuse, no mention of the voicemail where my father threatened to have me arrested. Instead, it was a litany of their misfortunes. How hard it was for them. How Sarah was struggling to find herself. And finally the pivot. They needed a loan. Just enough to catch up on the mortgage. They appealed to my sense of duty, claiming that family helps family, that blood is thicker than water. I stared at the screen, waiting for the guilt to come. I waited for that old, familiar ache that used to make me bend over backwards to please them. It never came. All I felt was relief. I shallallahu alayhi wasallam them clearly now, not as giants who controlled my destiny, but as sad, small people who had made their choices. They had bet everything on Sarah, investing all their love and resources into the child who reflected their vanity and disregarded the one who actually had the spine to succeed. Now that their investment had crashed, they wanted to hedge their bets with me. I hit reply. My fingers hovered over the keys. I could have written a furious manifesto. I could have thrown the stolen car threat back in their faces. I could have laughed at Sarah's failure. But that would have required emotional energy they no longer deserved. I am not your retirement plan and I am not your savior. Do not contact me again. I hit send, then blocked the email address. I closed my laptop and looked out the window of my condo. The city lights were blinking on in the twilight, a sprawling grid of possibilities. I thought about the car I drove now, a luxury sedan I bought with a single check registered solely in my name, parked safely in my garage. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from a friend asking if I wanted to grab dinner. I smiled, picked up the phone, and typed a reply. The past was a closed book, gathering dust on a shelf I would never reach for again. My life was waiting, and I wasn't going to let anyone drag me backward.